week at Brympton before I saw my master. Word came that he was arriving one afternoon, and a change passed over the whole household. It was plain that nobody loved him below stairs. Mrs. Blinder took uncommon care with the dinner that night, but she snapped at the kitchen maid in a way quite unusual with her, and Mr. Wace, the butler, a serious, slow-spoken man, went about his duties as if he'd been getting ready for a funeral. He was a great Bible reader, Mr. Wace was, and had a beautiful assortment of texts at his command, but that day he used such dreadful language that I was about to leave the table, when he assured me it was all out of his ire, and I noticed that whenever the master came, Mr. Wace took to the prophets. About 7, Agnes called me to my mistress's room, and there I found Mr. Brympton. He was standing on the hearth, a big, fair, bull-necked man, with a red face and little bad-tempered blue eyes, the kind of man a young simpleton might have thought handsome, and would have been like to pay dear for thinking it. He swung about when I came in, and looked me over in a trice. I knew what the look meant, from having experienced it once or twice in my former places. Then he turned his back on me, and went on talking to his wife, and I knew what that meant, too. I was not the kind of morsel he was after. The typhoid had served me well enough in one way. It kept that kind of gentleman at arm's length. "This is my new maid, Hartley," says Mrs. Brympton in her kind voice, and he nodded and went on with what he was saying. In a minute or two he went off and left my mistress to dress for dinner, and I noticed as I waited on her that she was white and chilled to the touch. Mr. Brympton took himself off the next morning, and the whole house drew a long breath when he drove away. As for my mistress, she put on her hat and furs, for it was a fine winter morning, and went out for a walk in the gardens, coming back quite fresh and rosy, so that for a minute, before her colour faded, I could guess what a pretty young lady she must have been, and not so long ago either. She had met Mr. Ranford in the grounds, and the two came back together, I remember, smiling and talking as they walked along the terrace under my window. That was the first time I saw Mr. Ranford, though I had often heard his name mentioned in the hall. He was a neighbour, it appeared, living a mile or two beyond Brympton, at the end of the village, and as he was in the habit of spending his winters in the countryside, he was almost the only company my mistress had at that season. He was a slight, tall gentleman of about 30, and I thought him rather melancholy-looking, till I saw his smile, which had a kind of surprise in it, like the first warm day in spring. He was a great reader, I heard, like my mistress, and the two were for ever borrowing books of one another, and sometimes, Mr. Wace told me, he would read aloud to Mrs. Brympton by the hour, in the big dark library where she sat in the winter afternoons. The servants all liked him, and perhaps that's more of a compliment than the masters suspect. He had a friendly word for every one of us, and we were all glad to think that Mrs. Brympton had a pleasant, companionable gentleman like that to keep her company when the master was away. Mr. Ranford seemed on excellent terms with Mr. Brympton too, though I couldn't but wonder that two gentlemen so unlike each other should be so friendly. But then I knew how the real quality can keep their feelings to themselves. As for Mr. Brympton, he came and went, never staying more than a day or two, cursing the dullness and the solitude, grumbling at everything, and, as I soon found out, drinking a deal more than was good for him. After Mrs. Brympton left the table, he would sit half the night over the old Brympton port and Madeira, and once, as I was leaving my mistress's room, rather later than usual, I met him coming up the stairs in such a state that I turned sick to think of what some ladies have to endure and hold their tongues about. The servants said very little about their master, but from what they let drop, I could see it had been an unhappy match from the beginning. Mr. Brympton was coarse, loud, and pleasure-loving, my mistress quiet, retiring, and perhaps a trifle cold. Not that she was not always pleasant-spoken to him. I thought her wonderfully forbearing, but to a gentleman as free as Mr. Brympton, I dare say she seemed a little offish. Well, things went on quietly for several weeks. My mistress was kind, my duties were light, and I got on well with the other servants. In short, I had nothing to complain of, yet there was always a weight on me. I can't say why it was so, but I know it was not the loneliness that I felt. I soon got used to that, and being still languid from the fever, I was thankful for the quiet and the good country air. Nevertheless, I was never quite easy in my mind. My mistress, knowing I had been ill, insisted that I should take my walk regular, and often invented errands for me, a yard of ribbon to be fetched from the village, a letter posted, or a book returned to Mr. Ranford. As soon as I was out of doors, my spirits rose, and I looked forward to my walks through the bare, moist-smelling woods. But the moment I caught sight of the house again, my heart dropped down like a stone in a well. It was not a gloomy house exactly, yet I never entered it but a feeling of gloom came over me. Mrs. Brympton seldom went out in winter. Only on the finest days did she walk an hour at noon on the south terrace. Excepting Mr. Ranford, we had no visitors but the doctor, who drove over from D about once a week. He sent for me once or twice to give me some trifling direction about my mistress, and though he never told me what her illness was, I thought, from a waxy look she had now and then of a morning, that it might be the heart that ailed her. The season was soft and unwholesome, and in January we had a long spell of rain. That was a sore trial to me, I own, for I couldn't go out, and sitting over my sewing all day, listening to the drip, drip of the eaves, I grew so nervous that the least sound made me jump. Somehow, the thought of that locked room across the passage began to weigh on me. Once or twice in the long rainy nights I fancied I heard noises there, but that was nonsense, of course, and the daylight drove such notions out of my head. Well, one morning Mrs. Brympton gave me quite a start of pleasure by telling me she wished me to go to town for some shopping. I hadn't known till then how low my spirits had fallen. I set off in high glee, and my first sight of the crowded streets and the cheerful-looking shops quite took me out of myself. Toward afternoon, however, the noise and confusion began to tire me, and I was actually looking forward to the quiet of Brympton and thinking how I should enjoy the drive home through the dark woods, when I ran across an old acquaintance, a maid I had once been in service with. We had lost sight of each other for a number of years, and I had to stop and tell her what had happened to me in the interval. When I mentioned where I was living, she rolled up her eyes and pulled a long face. "What? The Mrs. Brympton that lives all the year at her place on the Hudson? My dear, you won't stay there 3 months." "Oh, but I don't mind the country," says I, offended somehow at her tone. "Since the fever, I'm glad to be quiet." She shook her head. "It's not the country I'm thinking of. All I know is she's had 4 maids in the last 6 months, and the last one, who was a friend of mine, told me nobody could stay in the house." "Did she say why?" I asked. "No, she wouldn't give me her reason, but she says to me, 'Mrs. Anstey,' she says, 'if every young woman as you know of thinks of going there, you tell her it's not worth while to unpack her boxes.'" "Is she young and handsome?" said I, thinking of Mr. Brympton. "Not her. She's the kind that mothers engage when they've gay young gentlemen at college." Well, though I knew the woman was an idle gossip, the words stuck in my head, and my heart sank lower than ever as I drove up to Brympton in the dusk. There was something about the house. I was sure of it now. When I went in to tea, I heard that Mr. Brympton had arrived, and I saw at a glance that there had been a disturbance of some kind. Mrs. Blinder's hands shook so that she could hardly pour the tea, and Mr. Wace quoted the most dreadful texts full of brimstone. Nobody said a word to me then, but when I went up to my room, Mrs. Blinder followed me. "Oh, my dear," said she, taking my hand, "I'm so glad and thankful you've come back to us." That struck me, as you may imagine. "Why?" said I. "Did you think I was leaving for good?" No, to be sure," said she, a little confused. "But I can't abear to have Madame left alone for a day even." She pressed my hand hard, and, "Oh, Miss Hartley," said she, "be good to your mistress, as you're a Christian woman." And with that she hurried away, and left me staring. A moment later Agnes called me to Mrs. Brympton. Hearing Mr. Brympton's voice in her room, I went round by the dressing-room, thinking I would lay out her dinner-gown before going in. The dressing-room is a large room with a window over the portico that looks toward the gardens. Mr. Brympton's apartments are beyond. When I went in, the door into the bedroom was ajar, and I heard Mr. Brympton saying angrily, "One would suppose he was the only person fit for you to talk to." "I don't have many visitors in winter," Mrs. Brympton answered quietly. "You have me," he flung at her, sneering. "You are here so seldom," said she. "Well, whose fault is that? You make the place about as lively as a family vault." With that I rattled the toilet things to give my mistress warning, and she rose and called me in. The two dined alone as usual, and I knew by Mr. Wace's manner at supper that things must be going badly. He quoted the prophet something terrible, and worked on the kitchen maid so that she declared she wouldn't go down alone to put the cold meat in the icebox. I felt nervous myself, and after I had put my mistress to bed, I was half tempted to go down again and persuade Mrs. Blinder to sit up a while over a game of cards. But I heard her door closing for the night, and so I went on to my own room. The rain had begun again, and the drip, drip, drip seemed to be dropping into my brain. I lay awake listening to it, and turning over what my friend in town had said. What puzzled me was that it was always the maids who left. After a while I slept, but suddenly a loud noise awakened me. My bell had rung. I sat up, terrified by the unusual sound, which seemed to go on jangling through the darkness. My hands shook so that I couldn't find the matches. At length I struck a light and jumped out of bed. I began to think I must have been dreaming, but I looked at the bell against the wall, and there was the little hammer still quivering. I was just beginning to huddle on my clothes when I heard another sound. This time it was the door of the locked room opposite mine, softly opening and closing. I heard the sound distinctly, and it frightened me so that I stood stock still. Then I heard a footstep hurrying down the passage toward the main house. The floor being carpeted, the sound was very faint, but I was quite sure it was a woman's step. I turned cold with the thought of it, and for a minute or two I durstn't breathe or move. Then I came to my senses. "Alice Hartley," says I to myself, "someone left that room just now and ran down the passage ahead of you. The idea isn't pleasant, but you may as well face it. Your mistress has rung for you, and to answer her bell you've got to go the way that other woman has gone." Well, I did it. I never walked faster in my life, yet I thought I should never get to the end of the passage or reach Mrs. Brympton's room. On the way I heard nothing and saw nothing. All was dark and quiet as the grave. When I reached my mistress's door, the silence was so deep that I began to think I must be dreaming, and was half-minded to turn back. And then a panic seized me, and I knocked. There was no answer, and I knocked again, loudly. To my astonishment, the door was opened by Mr. Brympton. He started back when he saw me, and in the light of my candle, his face looked red and savage. "You?" he said in a queer voice. "How many of you are there, in God's name?" At that I felt the ground give under me, but I said to myself that he had been drinking, and answered as steadily as I could. "May I go in, sir? Mrs. Brympton has rung for me." "You may all go in for what I care," says he, and pushing by me walked down the hall to his own bedroom. I looked after him as he went, and to my surprise I saw that he walked as straight as a sober man. I found my mistress lying very weak and still, but she forced a smile when she saw me, and signed to me to pour out some drops for her. After that she lay without speaking, her breath coming quick and her eyes closed. Suddenly she groped out with her hand, and "Emma," says she, faintly. "It's Hartley, madam," I said. "Do you want anything?" She opened her eyes wide and gave me a startled look. "I was dreaming," she said. "You may go now, Hartley, and thank you kindly. I'm quite well again, you see." And she turned her face away from me.